The tape was discovered on a Thursday afternoon in November 2003, buried beneath 47 boxes of declassified federal documents in the basement archives of the Cincinnati District Court. The archivist who found it, a man whose name appears in no official report, described the moment with clinical precision. The reel was wrapped in brown paper, sealed with wax that had cracked with age. Someone had written a single word across it in faded ink: testimony. No one had requested this file. No one was looking for it. The magnetic tape itself was a Scotch 202, manufactured between 1968 and 1975, the kind used in federal interrogations and classified depositions. When played, it produced a voice. Female, damaged. The kind of damage that doesn't come from age or poor recording equipment, but from the throat itself, scarred, reconstructed, barely functional. The voice said, "My name is Sarah Elaine Whitaker, patient number 472. They drowned me 22 times. There was a pause, 7 seconds of tape hiss. Then, I need you to understand, it wasn't water that killed us. It was the silence after." The recording runs for 2 hours and 14 minutes. It was made in secret sometime in 1973, in a location that remains unidentified. The woman speaks slowly, as if each word costs her something irreplaceable. She names names, dates, procedures. She describes things that, according to official hospital records from the Willowbrook Institute for Mental Health, never happened. But records lie. Throats do not. According to federal case files, declassified only after a 75-year seal expired, Sarah Elaine Whitaker was admitted to Willowbrook on March 14, 1951. She was 28 years old. The commitment papers listed her as hysterical, delusional, prone to paranoid fabrications regarding local law enforcement. The signature belonged to Dr. Harlan Graves, Superintendent of Psychiatric Services. The countersignature belonged to Sheriff Clayton Dorsey of Pike County, Kentucky. Both men are dead now, one in federal prison, one in his sleep. But the tape remains. They called it hydrotherapy. The voice continues, rougher now, catching on syllables like fabric on barbed wire. Therapeutic submersion, cold water immersion therapy. They had so many names for it. What they didn't have was consent. The woman on the tape describes a procedure. It begins in a tiled room in the basement of Willowbrook's East Wing, in a section that does not appear on any architectural blueprint filed with the state of Ohio. There is a bathtub, industrial, cast iron, deep enough to submerge a body completely. The water is kept between 34 and 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold enough to shock the nervous system, not cold enough to kill immediately. The first time, she says, I thought they were washing me. I didn't understand until my head went under. 22 times. The archivist who found the tape made copies before submitting it to federal review. One copy reached a journalist. Another reached a lawyer who had been searching for evidence in a decades-old civil suit. A third copy simply disappeared. What followed changed nothing and everything. 3 sheriffs were eventually convicted on federal corruption charges, not for what they did to Sarah Whitaker, but for what they trafficked through Pike County between 1949 and 1953. Opiates, extracted illegally from pharmaceutical-grade morphine diverted from mining company medical supplies. The trial transcripts mention Willowbrook only once, in a footnote. It reads, "Witnesses were often detained in psychiatric facilities to prevent testimony." Detained. Such a clean word. Sarah Elaine Whitaker was born in 1923 in a town so small it no longer exists on modern maps. She died in 1998, in a house with no forwarding address. Between those years, she lived in the kind of silence that only survivors know. The silence that comes after you've been heard, and it didn't matter. But the tape matters, because somewhere in those 2 hours and 14 minutes, between the rasp of damaged vocal cords and the hiss of degraded magnetic ribbon, is a question that America never answered. Why does it take 75 years to hear a woman scream? The tape ends with breathing, just breathing, as if she's still underwater, as if she never left. Sarah Elaine Whitaker was born in the belly of the earth, or close enough to it. Pike County, Kentucky, 1923. Appalachian coal country, where mountains wore scars like medals and men disappeared into shafts that sometimes gave them back, sometimes didn't. Her father, Thomas Whitaker, was a union man before unions were legal in the eyes of mine owners. Her mother, Elaine Marsh Whitaker, took in laundry from families who could afford to keep their hands clean. They lived in a company house, 4 rooms, wood frame, painted the same industrial gray as every other structure the mining company owned. Rent was deducted directly from Thomas's wages. So was the cost of tools. So was the medical fund that rarely paid for medicine. Sarah learned to read from union pamphlets her father brought home, folded inside his lunch pail where supervisors wouldn't see them. By the time she was 7, she could recite passages from Eugene Debs. By 10, she understood why her father came home with bruises that had nothing to do with coal. In 1936, Thomas Whitaker died in what the company called an unfortunate structural collapse in Shaft 7. The report listed him as the only casualty. The union had a different count. 14 men, all of them agitators. All of them buried under rubble that fell too precisely to be accidental. Sarah was 13. The company offered her mother a settlement, $47 and eviction from the company house within 30 days. Elaine Whitaker took the money and moved them to a boarding house in Pikeville, where Sarah finished school working night shifts at a textile mill. She was thin, wire-strong, with her father's jaw and her mother's refusal to bend. By 1945, Sarah had found work as a secretary at the Pike County Courthouse. It was supposed to be respectable, safe, a life her father would have wanted. Off the mountain, out of the mines, clean hands and a future that didn't end underground. But Sarah had inherited more than her father's face. She had inherited his eyes, the kind that noticed when numbers didn't add up, when shipments came through the county at odd hours, when sheriffs drove cars their salaries couldn't afford and doctors wrote prescriptions for medications that never reached patients. It started with a conversation she wasn't supposed to hear. March 1949. Late evening in the courthouse basement, where old files were stored in rows of metal cabinets that smelled like mildew and government neglect. Sarah had stayed late, filing property deeds, when she heard voices in the corridor. Low, careful, the kind of voices men use when they're dividing something they shouldn't have. She recognized Sheriff Clayton Dorsey immediately. The other voice belonged to Dr. Raymond Mathers, a private physician who ran a clinic on the edge of town. "The morphine's clean," Mathers was saying. "Pharmaceutical grade, extracted from company medical supplies. No one's tracking it. And the distribution?" Dorsey's voice. "Through the usual channels. Veterans who got hooked overseas, housewives with prescriptions, anyone desperate enough not to ask questions. We move it through 3 counties, Pike, Floyd, Letcher. Willowbrook handles the ones who get too loud about it." Sarah pressed herself against the wall, breathing shallow. She didn't understand all of it. Not yet. But she understood enough to know that whatever Willowbrook was, it wasn't a place you went to get better. She started paying attention after that. Watching, listening. She noticed patterns. Mine workers who complained about safety violations suddenly committed for mental exhaustion. Union organizers diagnosed with nervous breakdowns and sent away. Women who witnessed domestic violence hospitalized for hysteria. Willowbrook was a name that appeared on commitment papers like a period at the end of a sentence. Final, absolute. Sarah began keeping her own records. Names, dates, conversations overheard in courthouse hallways. She stored them in a locked drawer of her mother's sewing table, written in a shorthand only she could read. In 1950, Sarah attended a union meeting in Hazard, Kentucky, a gathering of mine workers trying to organize across county lines. She stood in the back, 27 years old, one of only 3 women in the room. When they asked if anyone had information about retaliatory hospitalizations, Sarah spoke. She spoke clearly. She spoke with evidence. She spoke for 14 minutes. 3 weeks later, Dr. Raymond Mathers filed a medical evaluation stating that Sarah Elaine Whitaker exhibited chronic hysteria characterized by paranoid delusions regarding local government, erotomania, and acute moral insanity, rendering her a danger to herself and the community. The commitment order was signed by Judge Harold Pritchard, countersigned by Sheriff Clayton Dorsey, approved for indefinite psychiatric detainment at the Willowbrook Institute for Mental Health, Cincinnati, Ohio. On the night of March 13, 1951, Sarah Whitaker was removed from her mother's house by 2 deputies and a psychiatric orderly. She was handcuffed, sedated with a barbiturate injection administered without consent or explanation, loaded into the back of an unmarked vehicle. Her mother was told she could visit once Sarah was stabilized. No one told Elaine Whitaker that stabilization was a word with no fixed meaning, that visits required institutional approval, that approval was rarely granted, that some women entered Willowbrook and simply stopped existing in any recordable way. Sarah arrived at the Institute in the early hours of March 14, 1951. It was raining. She would later remember that detail with perfect clarity. The rain, cold and relentless, drumming against the roof of the vehicle as they drove through gates that closed behind her like a mouth. Between 1950 and 1951, Sarah Elaine Whitaker made a mistake that women before her had made, and women after her would continue making. She believed that truth was protection enough. It wasn't. The union meetings continued through the fall of 1950. Small gatherings in church basements, in the back rooms of sympathetic businesses, in homes where the curtains stayed drawn and voices stayed low. Sarah attended 7 of them. At the 5th meeting, in a Methodist church in Harlan County, she stood and presented what she'd documented, a pattern of retaliatory psychiatric commitments spanning 3 years, 23 cases, all involving individuals who had challenged mine safety violations or reported criminal activity involving local law enforcement. She had names, she had dates, she had commitment papers she'd copied from courthouse files when no one was looking. The room listened in the kind of silence that feels like held breath. A union organizer from Virginia asked if she'd taken this to the state attorney general. Sarah said she had, twice. Both letters went unanswered. Another organizer asked if she understood the risk. Sarah said she did. She didn't. Not really. Risk, in theory, is something you can measure and prepare for. What Sarah faced was something else entirely, a machinery of erasure so well-oiled that it functioned almost automatically, triggered by a single word in the wrong ear. The word, in this case, was testimony. On November 3, 1950, Sarah received her first home visit from Dr. Raymond Mathers. He arrived unannounced, accompanied by a county health inspector whose name appears in no official record. They said it was a routine wellness check, mandated by new county health ordinances. They asked Sarah about her sleep patterns, her menstrual cycle, whether she experienced nervous episodes or intrusive thoughts. Sarah refused to answer. She asked them to leave. Dr. Mathers noted in his report, "Patient exhibits hostile and paranoid behavior consistent with early-stage moral insanity. Recommends monitoring." The second visit came in December. This time, Dr. Mathers brought Sheriff Dorsey. They didn't ask to come in. They stood on the porch of the boarding house where Sarah and her mother rented rooms, speaking loud enough for neighbors to hear. Mathers explained that he'd received concerning reports about Sarah's mental state, that several community members had expressed worry, that he was obligated, as a medical professional, to ensure she wasn't a danger to herself. Sarah's mother, Elaine, stood in the doorway beside her daughter. "She's fine," Elaine said. "She's perfectly fine." "Ma'am," Sheriff Dorsey said, his voice carrying the kind of patience that's really a threat. "With all respect, family members are often the last to recognize mental deterioration." Sarah said nothing. She had learned by then that every word she spoke could be reinterpreted as a symptom. The visits became regular, weekly, then twice weekly, always unannounced, always documented. The reports accumulated in a file that Sarah would never see, but that would determine her future with surgical precision. December 8, 1950. Patient remains agitated, deflects questions, exhibits signs of delusional fixation on perceived conspiracies. January 12, 1951. Patient's affect is flat, uncooperative. Mother appears to be enabling paranoid ideation. February 3, 1951. Recommend immediate evaluation for institutional care. Patient poses escalating risk. Sarah tried to disappear into normalcy. She stopped attending union meetings, stopped asking questions at work. She filed papers, answered phones, kept her head down in a way that felt like drowning in air. But the machinery, once set in motion, doesn't stop for good behavior. On February 14, 1951, Valentine's Day, a detail Sarah would later recall with bitter irony, Dr. Mathers submitted a formal psychiatric evaluation to the Pike County Court. The document was 8 pages long, dense with medical terminology that translated, in essence, to a single conclusion. Sarah Elaine Whitaker was insane. The diagnosis: chronic hysteria with paranoid features, erotomania, and acute moral degeneration. Erotomania, a delusion of being loved by someone of higher social status. The evidence for this was Sarah's alleged obsession with Sheriff Dorsey and Dr. Mathers, manifested through her unfounded accusations of criminal behavior. Moral degeneration, an umbrella term applied almost exclusively to women whose behavior violated social expectations. In Sarah's case, unmarried at 27, politically outspoken, insufficiently deferential to male authority. The evaluation recommended indefinite commitment to a state psychiatric facility. Judge Harold Pritchard reviewed the case on March 2, 1951. The hearing lasted 11 minutes. Sarah was not present. Her mother was not notified. No defense was mounted because none was required under Kentucky law. Psychiatric commitment was a medical decision, not a criminal proceeding. The judge signed the order. Sheriff Dorsey executed it. On the night of March 13, 1951, Sarah was in her room at the boarding house, mending a skirt by lamplight, when she heard boots on the stairs. Heavy, purposeful, multiple sets. She knew what they meant. She stood. She didn't run. There was nowhere to run to. The door opened without knocking. 2 deputies entered first, followed by a man in orderly whites, an employee of Willowbrook sent to transport patients too difficult for local handling. "Miss Whitaker," one deputy said, "we have a court order for your psychiatric commitment." Sarah's mother appeared in the hallway, her face pale. No, she's done nothing. Ma'am, step aside. She's not crazy. Ma'am, I won't ask again." Sarah looked at her mother. She wanted to say something that would matter, something that would be remembered. But the orderly was already moving forward with a leather case, already preparing the syringe with practiced efficiency. "This will help you stay calm during transport," he said. Sarah felt hands on her arms, cold metal around her wrists, the bite of the needle in her upper arm, the spread of numbness through her shoulder, the dimming of the room like someone slowly turning down a lamp. The last thing she heard before the barbiturate pulled her under was her mother's voice, cracking like glass. "Where are you taking her?" "Willowbrook Institute, Cincinnati. She'll receive excellent care." Sarah tried to say "I love you," but her tongue had gone thick and useless. They carried her down the stairs like a piece of furniture. It was raining when they loaded her into the vehicle. Cold, relentless. She would remember that rain for the rest of her life. The Willowbrook Institute for Mental Health occupied 11 acres on the eastern bank of the Ohio River, 3 miles outside Cincinnati's industrial district. Built in 1892 as an asylum for the feeble-minded and morally deficient, it had evolved, if that word can be applied to institutional decay, into a sprawling complex of red brick buildings connected by underground tunnels and surrounded by walls that were ornamental in name only. They were 12 feet high, topped with iron finials that looked decorative from a distance, but served the same function as any prison fixture, to remind the confined that leaving was not a choice they were permitted to make. Sarah arrived in the early hours of March 14, 1951. The barbiturate had worn off enough for her to register sensations. The cold, the rain, the gravel crunching under the vehicle's tires as it approached the main gate. She was still handcuffed, still dressed in the clothes she'd been wearing when they took her. A wool skirt, a cotton blouse, a cardigan her mother had knitted. No coat. They hadn't let her bring a coat. The gate opened. The vehicle passed through. The gate closed. That sound, iron on iron, final as a period, would replay in Sarah's mind for decades. The main building loomed ahead, Gothic in the way institutional architecture often is. All vertical lines and narrow windows, designed to make human beings feel appropriately small. Light spilled from a few ground floor windows, yellow and insufficient. The rest of the structure was dark, absorbed into the night like something that preferred not to be looked at directly. The orderly who had administered the sedative opened the vehicle door. "Out," he said. Sarah's legs didn't work properly. The drug had left her coordination loose, unreliable. She stumbled on the first step. The orderly caught her by the arm, not gently, not cruelly, with the mechanical efficiency of someone who moved sedated bodies regularly enough that they'd stopped registering as human. They walked her through the front entrance, past a reception desk where a night nurse sat beneath a lamp that flickered like a dying heartbeat. The nurse glanced up, registered Sarah with the interest one might give a package delivered after hours, and returned to her paperwork. Down a corridor, tile floors, the kind that echo, walls painted institutional green, the color of nausea and government budgets. The smell hit Sarah in waves, disinfectant trying and failing to mask something underneath. Sweat, urine, decay, despair. It was a smell that would eventually stop registering, the way prisoners stop noticing the walls of their cells. But that first night, it was overwhelming. They stopped at a door marked intake. The orderly knocked twice, opened without waiting for a response, and guided Sarah inside. The room was small, windowless, lit by a single overhead bulb. A desk, 2 chairs, a metal filing cabinet. Behind the desk sat a woman in her 50s, gray hair pinned back with military precision, wearing a white nurse's uniform starched to the point of rigidity. Her name, according to the brass plate on the desk, was Edith Frost. The patients called her something else. Sarah would learn that later. "Patient 472, the orderly said, handing over a manila folder. Nurse Frost opened it, scanned the contents with eyes that gave nothing away. Sarah Elaine Whitaker, 28, chronic hysteria, paranoid delusions, moral insanity. She looked up. "Can you speak?" Sarah's mouth was dry, her tongue still thick from the barbiturate. "Yes. You will address staff as ma'am or sir. Do you understand?" "Yes." Nurse Frost waited. The silence stretched. Sarah understood, belatedly, what was expected. "Yes, ma'am. Better." Frost closed the folder. "You've been committed here for treatment. The duration of your stay depends entirely on your cooperation and progress. You will follow all institutional rules. You will attend all scheduled therapies. You will not speak to other patients about matters unrelated to your treatment. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am." "Remove your clothes." Sarah stared. "What?" "Remove your clothes. All personal items must be cataloged and stored. You'll be given institutional clothing." The orderly stood by the door, watching. Frost's expression suggested that modesty was a luxury Sarah had forfeited upon admission. Sarah undressed, slowly. Each item of clothing felt like a layer of identity being peeled away. The skirt, the blouse, the cardigan, undergarments, stockings. She stood naked under the fluorescent light, arms crossed over her chest, shivering from cold and something deeper than cold. Frost made notes. "No contraband. Proceed with intake shower." The orderly led Sarah down another corridor. She was beyond tracking direction now. To a tiled room with shower heads protruding from the walls at regular intervals. The water was already running. Cold. No controls visible. No way to adjust temperature. "Delousing protocol," the orderly said. "Stand under the center shower. Do not move." Sarah stepped forward. The water hit her like a physical blow, cold enough to stop breath. She gasped, tried to step back, but the orderly's hand on her shoulder kept her in place. 2 minutes. Don't move." The water pounded against her skull. She couldn't tell if she was crying because tears would have been indistinguishable from the shower's assault. Her skin burned with cold. Her teeth chattered. Her mind, still sluggish from sedation, tried to make sense of this. She had committed no crime. She had harmed no one. And yet here she stood, naked and freezing, being washed like livestock. When the 2 minutes ended, though it felt like hours, the orderly handed her a towel. Thin, rough, institutional. "Dry off, get dressed." The clothing was folded on a bench, a shapeless gray dress, thick cotton, no shape or style. Undergarments that had been washed so many times the fabric was nearly transparent. No stockings, canvas slippers, size too large. Sarah dressed in silence. They took her to Ward C, 3rd floor. The corridor was lined with doors, each with a small window reinforced with wire mesh. From behind the doors came sounds, weeping, muttering, the rhythmic thud of something, someone, hitting a wall repeatedly. Sarah's room was the 11th door on the left. The orderly unlocked it, gestured for her to enter. The room was 8 feet by 10 feet, a cot bolted to the wall, a thin mattress, a blanket, a metal bucket in the corner that Sarah understood, with sinking horror, was the toilet. A single window, barred, too high to see out of. The orderly left without speaking. The door closed, the lock turned. Sarah stood in the center of the room, still damp from the shower, wearing clothes that smelled like someone else, in a space that felt less like a room and more like a box designed to contain something no longer considered fully human. She sat on the cot. The mattress was thin enough to feel the metal frame beneath. Outside in the corridor, footsteps passed. Keys jingled. A woman's voice somewhere distant screamed once, then went silent. Sarah thought about her mother, about the union meetings, about the courthouse files she'd copied, now confiscated or destroyed, about the life she'd had 24 hours ago, which already felt like something that had happened to someone else. She did not cry. Crying felt like a concession she wasn't ready to make. Instead, she lay down on the cot, pulled the thin blanket over her shoulders, and stared at the ceiling until exhaustion pulled her under. When she woke, gray light filtered through the high window. Her first full day at Willowbrook had begun. The morning bell rang at 5:47 a.m. Not 6 o'clock, 5:47. Sarah would later understand that the arbitrary timing was intentional, designed to prevent routine, to keep patients perpetually off balance in a place where predictability might breed resistance. The door unlocked. An attendant Sarah hadn't seen before, male, middle-aged, expression of professional disinterest, stood in the corridor. "Breakfast. 10 minutes. Do not be late." Sarah followed the other women from Ward C down 2 flights of stairs to a dining hall that smelled of boiled cabbage and institutional despair. Long tables, metal trays. Food that was technically edible but resembled nothing so much as the concept of nutrition, rendered into its least appetizing form. She ate because not eating seemed like a faster path to whatever came next. At 7:15, her name was called. "Whitaker, report to treatment room 3. Treatment. The word arrived with no context, no explanation. Sarah followed the attendant down a corridor she didn't recognize, through a door that required 2 keys to open, into the basement level, where the temperature dropped 10 degrees, and the smell of disinfectant intensified to the point of violence. Treatment room 3 was tiled floor to ceiling, white tiles, grout-stained gray. In the center of the room stood a bathtub, cast iron, deep, industrial, large enough to submerge a body completely. Dr. Harlan Graves was waiting. He was a tall man, 63 years old according to records later subpoenaed, with the kind of face that photographs made authoritative and reality rendered cruel. Wire-rimmed glasses, white coat, clipboard held like a shield against doubt. "Patient 472, he said, consulting his notes. "Sarah Elaine Whitaker, you've been scheduled for hydrotherapy as part of your treatment protocol." Sarah's voice came out smaller than she intended. "What kind of treatment?" "Therapeutic cold water immersion. Highly effective for cases of hysteria and delusional thinking. The shock to the nervous system helps reset abnormal thought patterns." He said this with the certainty of a man who had never questioned whether what he was doing qualified as medicine or torture. Nurse Frost entered, accompanied by 2 orderlies. Male, large, present not for medical necessity, but for control. "Undress," Frost said. I don't understand what." Undress or you will be undressed. Sarah's hands shook as she removed the gray institutional dress. She stood in the white-tiled room naked again, under lights too bright to hide beneath. Into the tub. The water was already filled. Sarah could see her reflection on its surface, distorted and strange. She stepped in. The cold was immediate and absolute. Not the cold of winter, but the cold of something dead. Her breath caught. Her skin contracted, every nerve screamed. Sit. She sat, water to her shoulders. Already her teeth were chattering. The procedure, Dr. Graves explained from his position near the door, involves full submersion for intervals of increasing duration. We begin with 30 seconds. You will be brought up for breath, then resubmerged. The treatment typically requires multiple sessions for efficacy. Sarah opened her mouth to protest. To say what, she didn't know. To invoke rights she no longer had. To appeal to mercy in a system that had none. Nurse Frost's hand pushed her head underwater before she could speak. The world became blue-white silence. Panic is not a metaphor. It's a physiological response. Heart rate spikes, lungs burn. The primitive brain overrides everything else, screaming, breathe, 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 while the conscious mind knows that breathing means drowning. 30 seconds is not a long time, except when you're underwater, held down, and 30 seconds becomes a small eternity. Frost pulled her up. Sarah gasped, coughed, water streaming from her nose and mouth. Please. Down again. This time 40 seconds. The cold and the drowning merged into a single experience. Sarah's body convulsed. Her hands gripped the edges of the tub, nails scraping cast iron. But the orderlies were there immediately, prying her fingers loose, holding her arms. Up for air, down again, 50 seconds. On the fourth submersion, Sarah stopped fighting. Not from surrender, but from a calculation her oxygen-starved brain somehow managed. Fighting used air she didn't have. The instinct to survive paradoxically required the appearance of death. She went limp. Frost pulled her up, checked her pulse. Responsive, continue. The first session lasted 43 minutes. 5 full submersions. By the end, Sarah couldn't stop shaking. Not from cold, though she was hypothermic by any medical standard, but from a terror that had moved past fear into something cellular. They wrapped her in a rough towel, gave her back the gray dress. She couldn't make her fingers work the buttons. An attendant buttoned it for her with the same efficiency one might use to dress a corpse. Return to ward, Frost said. Treatment continues tomorrow. Sarah walked back to Ward C on legs that barely functioned. Other patients watched her pass, women with hollow eyes who recognized what had just happened because it had happened to them. In her cell, Sarah lay on the cot and stared at nothing. That night she heard screaming from somewhere below. Not the screaming of sudden pain, but the screaming of someone who has been screaming for a long time and no longer expects it to stop. The next morning, the bell rang at 5:47. At 7:15, her name was called again. The second session was worse because she knew what was coming. The knowing destroyed the small mercy of shock. They submerged her 6 times, 60 seconds each by the third round. On the 5th day, they held her under for 90 seconds. Sarah's mind began to fracture in the way minds do when subjected to methodical torture disguised as treatment. She started to lose track of time. Not just the hours and days, but the continuity of self. Who was she before the water? Did that person still exist? By the end of the first week, Sarah had endured 5 sessions. Her vocal cords, strained from screaming underwater, began to fail. Her voice came out ragged, torn. The attendants noticed. They commented on it with clinical interest, as if observing a symptom rather than a consequence of what they were doing to her. Nurse Frost made a note in Sarah's file. Patient exhibits reduced vocalization. Positive response to treatment protocol. Continue hydrotherapy. In the corridor, the other patients had started calling her something new. Not her name, not her number. The silent one. Sem Fala. The girl there drowning. Sarah lay in her cell at night and tried to remember her mother's face. Tried to hold on to the memory of sunlight. Tried to believe that this would end. But Willowbrook had taught its first lesson well. Nothing ended here except hope. And the water was waiting for tomorrow. On the 14th day of Sarah's confinement, something shifted. Not in her treatment. The hydrotherapy continued with metronomic regularity, every morning at 7:15. 6 submersions, 90 seconds each. Not in her cell, which remained 8 feet by 10 feet of controlled despair. The shift came from an accident of bureaucracy, a transfer order that placed Sarah temporarily in Ward B, while Ward C underwent what the administration called sanitation procedures. Ward B occupied the East Wing's second floor, older construction, corridors that branched at odd angles, architecture that predated the standardized asylum designs of the early 20th century. Sarah was being moved by a single attendant, a violation of protocol, but staffing was thin that afternoon, and Ward B was considered low security. The attendant, a man named Thomas Briggs, according to records later obtained, was in his 3rd week of employment, knew enough to still see patients as people, not knew enough to risk his job by treating them as such. They walked down a corridor Sarah hadn't seen before. Fewer lights, older tile. The smell different here. Not the sharp chemical assault of the treatment floors, but something earthier. Damp stone. Decay. Briggs stopped at a junction where the corridor split 3 ways. He consulted a paper with room assignments, frowning. "They changed the numbers," he muttered. "Nothing's where it's supposed to be." While he was distracted, Sarah looked down the left corridor. At the far end, barely visible in the dim light, was a door. Steel. Riveted. The kind of door that doesn't belong in a hospital unless the hospital is hiding something it doesn't want classified as a hospital. And below the door, seeping out like a secret refusing to stay buried. Water. Not a leak. Not condensation. Water that flowed with purpose, as if something on the other side was being washed away continuously. "This way," Briggs said, choosing the right corridor. But Sarah had seen, that night in her new cell in Ward B, identical to the old cell except for a crack in the wall that looked like a reaching hand. Sarah lay awake and thought about that door, about the water beneath it, about the fact that treatment room 3, where they drowned her daily, was on the basement level directly below the main building. But that steel door was on the 2nd floor, which meant there was another basement. The next morning, after hydrotherapy, 7 submersions now, her record, Sarah was returned to Ward B. The same attendant, Briggs, still learning the layout. This time she paid attention to the route, counted doorways, memorized turns. 3 days later, during the supervised exercise period in the walled courtyard, 20 minutes of walking in circles while attendants watched for escape attempts, Sarah found herself next to another patient. A woman in her 50s, gray-haired, with the kind of stillness that comes from years of institutional survival. "You're new," the woman said without looking at her. In Willowbrook, direct eye contact drew attention. 2 weeks, Sarah replied, her voice still rough. "I've been here 11 years. They brought me in for depression after my husband died. Signed me in for observation. Observation doesn't end." She paused. "You've seen the basement door." Sarah's heart rate spiked. "What?" "East wing, 2nd floor, left corridor. Everyone sees it eventually. No one talks about it." "What's down there?" The woman's jaw tightened. "Where do you think they practice?" "Practice? The treatments they use on us, the drowning, the shocks, the insulin comas. You think they invented those methods here? You think Willowbrook is the only place?" The woman's voice dropped to barely audible. "They test here. Perfect population. We're already labeled insane. Who believes the testimony of a madwoman?" Sarah felt cold that had nothing to do with her still wet hair. "Test what?" "Interrogation techniques. Ways to break people without leaving marks. The government pays for it. Called it enhanced psychiatric research in the documents I saw before they caught me reading." The woman glanced sideways, finally meeting Sarah's eyes. "Why do you think they keep drowning you? You think that cures hysteria? It's practice. For when they need to make someone talk, or stop talking." An attendant shouted, "No conversations, keep walking." They separated. Sarah completed her circle of the courtyard, mind racing. That night, she waited until the corridor outside her cell was quiet. The night shift was smaller, lazier. Attendants did rounds every 2 hours. Sarah had been counting. At 2:17 a.m., she heard footsteps pass her door, waited 15 minutes, then pressed her face to the small window. Empty corridor. The lock on Ward B cells was older than Ward C. Sarah had been observing, had noticed that the bolt didn't seat completely if the door was closed at a certain angle, had tested it twice during the day when attendants weren't watching. She pushed. The door opened 3 inches before the security chain caught. But 3 inches was enough to see. The corridor was dark except for a single light at the far end. Sarah listened. Silence. She slipped her hand through the gap, felt for the chain mechanism. It was secured with a simple hook clasp, designed to be opened quickly in emergencies. She unhooked it. The door swung open. Sarah stood in the corridor of Willowbrook Institute for Mental Health, unsupervised, unchained for the first time since her arrival. Every instinct screamed to run. But where? The building was locked from the inside at night. The grounds were walled. Guards patrolled. Instead, she moved toward the left corridor, toward the steel door. It took 4 minutes to reach it. 4 minutes of walking on feet that barely made sound. Past cells where women slept or wept or stared at walls. Past the nursing station that was blessedly empty. The steel door was locked, but beside it, set into the wall at knee height, was a ventilation grate. Sarah knelt, put her ear to the grate. Sounds rose from below, machinery humming, water running, and voices. Complete the next trial by Thursday. Senator wants results. Subjects responding well to extended submersion. We've documented consciousness maintained up to 4 minutes. Not about therapy. It's about breaking resistance. If we can do it here, we can do it anywhere. Sarah's hands were shaking. She pressed closer to the grate, straining to hear. Whitaker's subject is ideal. Prior political activism, documented tendency toward resistance, strong survival instinct. If the protocol works on her, footsteps, close, coming down the main corridor. Sarah ran. Back to her cell, heart hammering, mind unable to process what she'd heard. She pulled the door closed, hooked the chain, threw herself onto the cot. 30 seconds later, an attendant walked past on rounds. Sarah lay in the dark, her damaged voice whispering into silence. They're not trying to cure me, they're using me. The words hung in the air like an indictment. And somewhere below, in basements that didn't exist on any official blueprint, the machinery kept humming. By the 4th week, Sarah had been drowned 18 times. Her voice was nearly gone. What remained was a harsh whisper that hurt to produce and hurt others to hear. The sound of vocal cords that had been screamed raw, submerged, and denied the rest needed to heal. The other patients had fully adopted the nickname Semfala, the Silent One. Sarah began to understand that silence, in Willowbrook, was a form of power. Those who screamed were sedated. Those who fought were restrained. Those who argued were given electroshock. But those who went quiet, who became ghosts in gray institutional dresses, were sometimes overlooked. Sarah became a ghost. She attended hydrotherapy without resistance, ate her meals without complaint, followed orders with a compliance that was noted in her file as significant improvement in cooperative behavior. Dr. Graves wrote, Patient 472 showing positive response to treatment protocol. Delusions appear to be diminishing. Recommend continued therapy. But Sarah's silence was tactical. During exercise period, she made contact with 2 other women. The first was the gray-haired patient who'd warned her about the basement, a woman named Margaret Doyle, committed in 1940 for melancholia, after refusing to give her dead husband's pension to his brother. The second was younger, mid-30s, named Ruth Kessler. Ruth had been institutionalized for nymphomania, a diagnosis applied when she'd reported sexual assault by her employer, and was deemed obsessed with sexual matters. They spoke in fragments during the supervised courtyard walks, never more than a sentence at a time. The attendant on night shift, Margaret whispered during one pass. Briggs, he has a conscience. Conscience doesn't mean action, Ruth replied. But it means vulnerability, Sarah said, her ruined voice barely audible. They began to plan not an escape, Escaping was impossible. But a documentation. If they could prove what was happening in the basement levels, if they could get evidence beyond the walls, perhaps someone would care. Perhaps someone would act. It was a desperate hope, the kind that only makes sense when hopelessness has become unbearable. Thomas Briggs had been at Willowbrook for 6 weeks when Sarah approached him. It was during a transfer between wards. Sarah stumbled deliberately, fell against the wall. Briggs steadied her, and in that moment, with no other staff in sight, Sarah looked directly at him and whispered 4 words. "You know this is wrong." Briggs's face went carefully blank. "Keep walking." "They're torturing us. They're not treating us. I said keep walking. You're not like them. You still have—" His hand tightened on her arm, not violent but urgent. "Stop talking." But his eyes said something else. His eyes said, "I know." 3 days later, Briggs was assigned to night rounds on Ward B. He found a note under his clipboard, written on a scrap of bedsheet in stolen ink. Room 14. 2 a.m. Please. He should have reported it, should have confiscated the note, filed an incident report, had the patient placed in isolation. Instead, at 2:03 a.m., Thomas Briggs stood outside cell 14 and whispered, "I'm listening." Sarah pressed her face to the door window. "There are basements they don't show you. Rooms where they're doing things that aren't medical. I heard them talking. They're testing interrogation methods, using us as subjects. That's insane." "Exactly what they said about me," Sarah's voice cracked. "I was committed for witnessing a crime. They're silencing witnesses with psychiatric diagnoses. This whole place is— I can't help you escape. I'm not asking for escape. I'm asking for proof. There are documents in Dr. Graves' office, files they keep separate from standard patient records. If you could— You're asking me to commit career suicide. I'm asking you to remember what you believed before you started working here." Briggs was silent for a long moment. Then, "I'll think about it." He walked away. Sarah didn't know if he would help, but she'd planted a seed in the only soil available. The hydrotherapy continued. Session 19, Session 20. Sarah's body had learned to endure what no body should have to endure. She'd discovered that the human capacity for survival extends into territories that look like death. But survival had costs. During the 20th session, something broke, not in Sarah's body, in her perception. As they held her under, as her lungs burned and her vision darkened, she felt herself split. Part of her remained in the tub, drowning. Part of her floated above, watching with detached clinical interest. Dissociation, psychologists would later call it, a defense mechanism, the mind protecting itself by pretending it's somewhere else. Sarah called it practice for disappearing. When they pulled her up, Nurse Frost noted, patient remained unusually calm during submersion. Increased resistance to panic response. Dr. Graves reviewed the note with satisfaction. Excellent. The treatment is achieving neurological reorganization. Proceed to extended protocol. Extended protocol meant longer submersions. 4 minutes. 5. At 5 minutes underwater, the human brain begins to die. Sarah made it to 4 minutes and 40 seconds before they pulled her up. She coughed water for 20 minutes afterward. Her lips were blue, her heartbeat irregular. By any medical standard, she should have been hospitalized. Instead, they sent her back to her cell. That night, Thomas Briggs appeared at her door at 2:15 a.m. He didn't speak, just slid a folded paper through the gap beneath the door. Sarah waited until she heard his footsteps fade, then unfolded the document. It was a photocopy. Poor quality, but readable. Memorandum. Classified to Dr. H. Graves, Willowbrook Institute. From DoD Research Division RE Progress Report, Project Artichoke. Extension date, April 1951. Continued trials in advanced interrogation resistance testing show promising results. Subject pool from psychiatric population provides ideal conditions for protocol development. Recommend expansion of submersion trials to establish threshold limits for consciousness maintenance under duress. Funding approved for next fiscal quarter. Ensure all documentation remains sealed under medical privilege statutes. Sarah read it 3 times. Project Artichoke. She'd heard that name before, in newspaper articles about government programs testing mind control and interrogation techniques. She'd thought it was conspiracy theory. It wasn't. The next morning, during hydrotherapy session 21, Sarah did something she'd never done before. She fought. Not physically, that would only bring more restraints. She fought with her silence. When Dr. Graves asked if she understood the treatment protocol, Sarah didn't answer. When Nurse Frost ordered her to undress, Sarah complied, but maintained eye contact, unblinking, unflinching, human. Patient is exhibiting renewed resistance behaviors, Frost noted. Increased treatment intensity, Graves replied. Some subjects require additional sessions to achieve compliance. They held her under for 5 minutes and 12 seconds. Sarah's heart stopped for 18 seconds before they revived her. When she came back, gasping, convulsing, more dead than alive, the first thought that formed in her oxygen-starved brain was, I remembered what they said, remembered the names, remembered everything she'd need to testify, if she survived to testify. That night, Margaret Doyle was found dead in her cell. Natural causes, the report said. Heart failure. She was 54 years old with no prior cardiac issues. The women of Ward B knew better. They knew what happened to patients who knew too much. Sarah lay in her cell and realized that documentation wasn't enough. They needed to survive long enough to use it. Before Willowbrook, Sarah had witnessed 3 murders. She hadn't understood them as murders at the time. That clarity came only in retrospect, in the long nights of her confinement when memory became the only possession they couldn't confiscate. The first was her father. Thomas Whitaker, 39 years old, crushed in Shaft 7 of the Pike County No. 3 mine on August 14, 1936. The official report called it structural collapse. The union called it deliberate. Sarah, 13 years old, standing at his graveside, had noticed the mine supervisor in his expensive coat, smoking a cigar, watching the burial with the satisfaction of a problem solved. The second was a man named James Hewitt, union organizer from Virginia, found dead in a Pike County motel room in March 1949. Official cause, accidental overdose of sleeping pills. Accidental, despite the fact that Hewitt had given a speech about mine safety 3 hours before his death, and despite the fact that Sarah had seen Sheriff Dorsey leaving the motel at 11 p.m., an hour before the body was discovered. The third was a woman named Dorothy Chen, immigrant, seamstress. Witnessed a beating in an alley behind the courthouse. 3 deputies pummeling a black man accused of talking back. Dorothy tried to file a report. She was found in the Ohio River 2 weeks later. Drowning, they said. Despite Dorothy being an excellent swimmer who'd crossed from China to California by boat and worked on fishing vessels for a decade. Sarah had tried to connect these deaths, had documented the patterns, had spoken at that union meeting in Hazard, Kentucky, in front of 37 witnesses who later claimed they couldn't remember what she'd said. Now, in Treatment Room 3, submerged for the 22nd time, Sarah understood what all 3 victims had learned too late. The system protects itself, and those who threaten the system are removed with efficiency that looks like everything except what it is. The 22nd session was different from the beginning. Dr. Graves entered with 3 men Sarah had never seen before. They wore suits, not medical coats. Federal agents, perhaps, or contractors. The distinction hardly mattered. They observed with the clinical interest of people evaluating merchandise. This is the subject who's maintained consciousness through extended submersion? One asked. Correct, Graves replied. Highly resilient psychological profile, prior to treatment, exhibited significant oppositional tendencies. The protocol has been effective in establishing compliance while maintaining cognitive function. They were talking about Sarah as if she were absent, as if her body lying on the examination table was a thing being demonstrated, not a person listening to every word. Proceed with maximum duration trial, the man said. Nurse Frost prepared the restraints, leather straps across Sarah's chest, arms, legs. They'd never used restraints before, the implication being that this session required measures that previous ones hadn't. They submerged her. 6 minutes. Sarah's mind tracked time with obsessive precision, even as her body screamed for oxygen. She counted seconds, counted heartbeats, counted the number of times she almost gave up and didn't. At 4 minutes, her vision began to tunnel. At 5 minutes, she felt her consciousness start to fragment. At 5 minutes and 43 seconds, she experienced what medical literature calls cerebral hypoxia, brain death's waiting room. At 6 minutes, they pulled her up. Resuscitation took longer this time. They had to use adrenaline, had to manually restart her heart. When Sarah came back, coughing water that tasted like death, she heard one of the suited men say, "Impressive threshold. How many subjects have you tested to this duration?" Whitaker is the 7th to exceed 5 minutes. The others didn't survive. The words hung in the air like an admission that nobody seemed to notice. Document the results. We'll want this replicated in other facilities. They left. Graves and Frost remained, making notes. Sarah lay on the table, restrained, still coughing, unable to move or speak or do anything except exist in the aftermath of her own near death. "Return patient to ward," Graves said. "Schedule next session for tomorrow. Final trial." Final. The word carried implications Sarah didn't want to examine. That night, Thomas Briggs appeared at her cell. He looked haunted. "I heard what they did today. I heard them talking about—" He stopped. "You need to know that I've made copies of everything I could find. Documents, files, the memorandum, I've hidden them outside the facility." Sarah's voice was gone entirely now. She could only mouth words. "Why?" "Because Margaret was right. This isn't medicine, this is— I don't know what this is, but it's wrong." He paused. "I'm going to try to help you. I don't know how yet, but I promise you I'm going to try." He left. Sarah didn't sleep. Couldn't sleep. Her body was in shock, her nervous system firing electrical signals that had no destination except panic. At 3 a.m., Ruth Kessler managed to slip a note under Sarah's door. It was written on a scrap of toilet paper in stolen pencil. They took Margaret because she knew. They'll take you next. Fight. But fighting, Sarah had learned, only accelerated the violence. The next morning came with the inevitability of execution. Session 23. The final trial. They strapped her down before she even saw the tub. Dr. Graves explained the protocol with the detachment of a man describing a routine procedure. Extended submersion to establish maximum survivable threshold. Duration to be determined by subject response. Revival procedures on standby. Translation: they were going to drown her until she died or until they decided to stop. Whichever came first. The water was colder this time, 32 degrees, just above freezing. They submerged her. Sarah stopped counting at 3 minutes. Her mind couldn't hold numbers anymore. Couldn't hold anything except a single thought repeated like a prayer. Remember, remember, remember. Remember the names. Sheriff Clayton Dorsey. Dr. Raymond Mathers. Judge Harold Pritchard. Remember the dates: March 14, 1951. Project Artichoke DoD funding. Remember the truth, that this wasn't treatment, wasn't research, wasn't anything except cruelty disguised in medical terminology. At some point, Sarah's consciousness separated entirely from her body. She watched herself from above, a gray figure strapped to metal, submerged in liquid death, surrounded by people in white coats who'd convinced themselves this was science. She watched them pull her limp body from the water, watched them administer CPR, watched her heart refuse to restart, watched Nurse Frost prepare the adrenaline injection with hands that didn't shake, that had done this before, that would do it again. The needle went into Sarah's chest, her heart lurched, stopped, lurched again. She came back gasping. The first thing she heard was Dr. Graves. 7 minutes, 42 seconds, document it. That's our new threshold. 7 minutes, 42 seconds. She'd been dead for almost 8 minutes. They declared the treatment complete and successful. Noted in her file that she'd been cured of hysterical tendencies, and could be transferred to long-term custodial care, the ward where patients who'd been broken beyond function were warehoused until they died quietly. But Sarah wasn't broken. She was forged. In that moment between death and revival, in those 8 minutes when her heart had stopped and her brain had somehow continued, she'd made a decision. She would survive. She would remember. And one day, when the walls finally fell, she would speak. Even if her voice was ruined, even if no one believed her, she would speak. The final 4 sessions were never supposed to happen. According to Dr. Graves's treatment protocol, filed in duplicate, 1 copy for Willowbrook's records, 1 for the Department of Defense Liaison Office, Sarah Elaine Whitaker's hydrotherapy treatment had concluded successfully after 22 documented sessions. Patient 472 had been stabilized and recommended for transfer to Ward F, the custodial wing where broken women spent their remaining years in medicated quietude. But Sarah had made a mistake. She'd survived too well. On May 3, 1951, 3 days after her 22nd session, a routine medical examination revealed something that shouldn't have been possible. Sarah's cognitive function remained intact, more than intact. When tested by a visiting psychiatrist from the state board, she scored in the superior range on memory recall, spatial reasoning, and verbal comprehension. Her voice was destroyed. Her body showed signs of severe physiological trauma. But her mind, the thing they'd been trying to break, remained unbroken. Dr. Graves received a memorandum from his Department of Defense contact. It was brief. Subject 472 represents statistical anomaly. Recommend additional trials to establish failure threshold. Authorization granted for extended protocol. Extended protocol was bureaucratic language for something that had no medical justification. They were going to keep drowning her until she broke or died, whichever came first. Session 23, May 7th, 1951. They brought her to treatment room 3 at dawn. No breakfast, no preparation, just hands on her arms and the long walk down corridors she could navigate blind. This time they didn't ask her to undress. They cut the gray institutional dress off her body with surgical scissors, efficiency replacing any pretense of dignity. The water was waiting. 30 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that steam rose from the surface in the cool basement air. This session will test sustained submersion without interval, Dr. Sy. Graves announced to the 3 observers. Different men this time, faces Sarah would never forget, even as she forgot her own reflection. Duration, 8 minutes. Revival protocol standing by. 8 minutes. The human brain begins irreversible damage at 6 minutes without oxygen. They were aiming for permanent destruction. Nurse Frost's hands pushed Sarah's head under. The cold hit like a physical blow. Sarah's body convulsed involuntarily, burning precious oxygen. She forced herself still, forced her mind to separate from the screaming of her lungs. She counted. 1, 2, 3. At 90 seconds, her vision started to darken. At 3 minutes, the pain became abstract, distant. At 5 minutes, Sarah felt her consciousness begin to slip away, not into darkness, but into something else. A space without time, without sensation, without self. At 7 minutes, they pulled her up. Revival took 43 minutes. They used adrenaline twice, electric defibrillation once. Sarah came back with blood in her mouth from where she'd bitten through her tongue. Subject survived 8-minute trial, Graves noted. Cognitive assessment pending. They dragged her back to her cell. She couldn't walk, couldn't speak, could barely breathe. But she could think, and what she thought was 3 more. Session 24, May 9th, 1951. Ruth Kessler tried to stop them. When the attendants came for Sarah, Ruth threw herself between them and the cell door. No, no more. You're killing her. They sedated Ruth with an injection that left her unconscious for 16 hours. Sarah walked to treatment room 3 on her own, numb, beyond fear, beyond anything except the mechanical action of one foot in front of the other. This time, they added weights, ankle restraints with 10-pound plates, to prevent involuntary floating, to ensure complete submersion. 9 minutes. Sarah's last conscious thought before they pushed her under was a memory. Her father's funeral. The way her mother had held her hand. The way the Kentucky rain had fallen soft and steady like tears the earth was crying for them. At 9 minutes, Sarah's heart stopped. They revived her. It took an hour. When she opened her eyes, Dr. Graves was writing notes, not looking at her, not acknowledging that he'd just killed someone and brought them back. Interesting, he said to no one in particular. The psychological resilience factor appears independent of physical threshold. Sarah wanted to scream that she wasn't a factor, wasn't a threshold, wasn't an interesting data point, but her voice was gone. Session 25, May 12, 1951. Thomas Briggs was fired on May 11, 1951. Official reason: violation of patient confidentiality protocols. Real reason: someone had discovered the copied documents missing from Dr. Graves's office. Sarah learned this from Nurse Frost, who mentioned it casually while preparing the restraints. Your friend, the attendant, won't be helping you anymore. He's been removed from the facility. Permanently. The word permanently carried weight. Sarah wondered if Thomas Briggs would be found in the Ohio River, or in an alley, or simply disappeared, the way people who knew too much often did. She hoped he'd run far enough. Session 25 lasted 10 minutes. Sarah's brain was oxygen deprived for so long that when they revived her, she couldn't remember her own name for 20 minutes. But she remembered the names that mattered: Dorsey, Mathers, Pritchard, Graves. She repeated them silently, a litany, an anchor to identity. Session 26, May 15, 1951. The final session was different. They brought her to treatment room 3, but the observers were gone. Just Graves and Frost. The tub was empty. Sarah stood in the center of the room, naked and shivering, waiting for water that didn't come. Sit, Graves said, gesturing to a chair. Sarah sat. Graves studied her with the clinical interest of a scientist examining a successful experiment. Patient 472, Sarah Elaine Whitaker. You've endured 25 sessions of intensive hydrotherapy. Your psychological profile indicates complete treatment resistance. Cognitively, you remain functional despite extreme physiological trauma. This presents a unique situation. Sarah said nothing, had nothing to say. The federal funding for this project has been discontinued, Graves continued. Budget reallocations, policy shifts. The research phase is over. He paused. Which means you're no longer useful as a test subject. Sarah's heart hammered. This was execution. This was how it ended. However, Graves said, you're also too dangerous to release. You've seen too much, heard too much. If you were to speak about what happened here, he shook his head. We can't allow that risk. So we're transferring you to Ward F under permanent custodial status. No visitors, no correspondence, no possibility of release. Frost handed him a document. You'll be declared incompetent to testify in any legal proceeding. Your commitment will be indefinite. It was a life sentence. Graves signed the transfer order. Frost administered an injection, sedative, for the transfer. Sarah felt the drug spread through her system, felt consciousness slipping. The last thing she heard before the darkness took her was Graves saying, "Dispose of all trial documentation. This program never existed." But programs leave traces. Documents get copied. Whistleblowers talk. And sometimes, decades later, the truth crawls out of the graves where it was buried. Sarah woke in Ward F, the forgotten wing, where women became ghosts before they died. She would spend the next 22 years there, but she would not forget. And one day, someone would listen. 22 years is a long time to be dead while still breathing. Ward F occupied the northernmost building of Willowbrook Institute, a structure built in 1897 and never updated. No treatment rooms, no therapy schedules, no pretense of rehabilitation, just rows of beds where women sat or lay or stared at walls, kept alive through routine feeding and basic medical care, warehoused until nature completed what institutional cruelty had begun. Sarah Elaine Whitaker, patient 472. though that number meant nothing in Ward F, where patients had no identities worth tracking, spent those years in a space between life and death, medicated enough to prevent violence, not medicated enough to erase memory. She watched women arrive broken and leave in coffins. She watched seasons change through barred windows. She watched America transform outside walls that never moved. 1951 became 1960. The Korean War ended. The Civil Rights Movement began. Elvis Presley sang on radios that Ward F patients never heard. 1960 became 1970. Kennedy was assassinated. Vietnam burned. Men walked on the moon. None of it reached the women who'd been erased from the world. Sarah didn't speak during those years, not because she couldn't. Her voice had partially healed, scarred but functional, but because speaking in Ward F was pointless. No one listened. No one cared. Words evaporated into recycled air that smelled of disinfectant and resignation. But Sarah remembered. She remembered every session, every name, every word overheard through basement vents. She carved the memories into her mind like inscriptions on stone, preserving them against the erosion of time and medication. Because somewhere, in some future she couldn't imagine, someone might care. Someone might listen. 1973. Change came from an unexpected direction. Scandal. Not Willowbrook's scandal. The Institute had operated for 81 years without significant oversight, but a scandal in New York, at another facility with a similar name, Willowbrook State School. A young reporter named Geraldo Rivera exposed conditions there with hidden cameras and moral outrage that finally pierced public indifference. The expose triggered federal investigations into institutional care across America. Willowbrook Institute for Mental Health Ohio fell under scrutiny. A federal inspector arrived in March 1973. A woman named Claire Hendricks, mid-40s, with the kind of determination that comes from having fought bureaucracy long enough to know its weaknesses. She toured Ward F on her third day. She saw women sitting in rows, motionless, institutionalized into furniture. She saw conditions that violated every standard of human care. She saw what America had been pretending didn't exist: concentration camps disguised as hospitals. Hendricks began pulling files, reviewing commitment papers, checking legal authorizations. She found Sarah's file in a cabinet marked permanent custodial. No review. The commitment date, March 14th, 1951, 22 years prior. Diagnosis: hysteria, paranoid delusions, moral insanity. Legal status: incompetent, indefinite commitment. Hendricks noted something odd. No supporting documentation. No psychiatric evaluations beyond the initial intake. No treatment records beyond the first 3 months. It was as if Sarah had been committed and then forgotten, left to age in place like abandoned property. Hendricks requested an interview. On March 27, 1973, Sarah sat across a table from the first person in 22 years who'd asked her a question expecting an answer. "Can you tell me your name?" Hendricks asked. Sarah's voice emerged rough, damaged, but clear. "Sarah Elaine Whitaker." "Do you know why you were committed here?" "Yes." "Can you tell me?" Sarah looked at this woman who'd asked a question no one had asked in 2 decades. She made a calculation: trust or silence. Risk or safety? She chose risk. "I witnessed corruption, sheriff's department in Pike County, Kentucky, drug trafficking, murder. I tried to report it. They diagnosed me as insane to silence me." Hendricks wrote notes. Her expression gave nothing away. "That's a serious allegation. I have proof, had proof, documentation. They took it when they committed me. Do you remember specifics? Names? Dates?" Sarah closed her eyes, opened them. "Sheriff Clayton Dorsey, Dr. Raymond Mathers, Judge Harold Pritchard, March 1951. They ran opiates through 3 counties, killed union organizers, used this facility to warehouse witnesses." Hendricks stopped writing, looked up. "This facility? They drowned me. 22 times. Called it hydrotherapy. It was interrogation training. Federal program, Project Artichoke. Sarah's ruined voice cracked. I died. They brought me back. I remembered everything. Most people would have dismissed this as delusional, the ravings of a damaged mind. But Claire Hendricks had been a federal investigator before becoming an inspector. She knew about Artichoke, knew about CIA programs, testing interrogation methods, knew they'd used psychiatric facilities as cover. I'm going to record your statement, she said. Everything you remember. Will you consent to that? Sarah nodded. They recorded for 4 hours and 37 minutes. Sarah spoke every name, every date, every detail of every session. The basement doors, the observation rooms, the federal agents in suits, the memorandum about DoD funding. When she finished, Hendricks said, I'm going to investigate this. I'm going to find corroboration, and if what you're saying is true, it's true. Then people will be held accountable. Sarah had heard promises before. She didn't believe in them anymore. But she'd spoken. That was enough. The investigation Hendricks was thorough. She subpoenaed records from Pike County, Kentucky, found that Sheriff Clayton Dorsey had been indicted in 1967 on federal corruption charges, drug trafficking, bribery, abuse of office. He'd served 8 years in federal prison and died in 1975. Dr. Raymond Mathers had lost his medical license in 1963 for prescription fraud, died of cirrhosis in 1970. Judge Harold Pritchard had resigned in 1959 amid allegations of impropriety, died in 1968. They were all dead. None had faced charges related to Willowbrook. But Hendricks found something else. Thomas Briggs, the former attendant, had fled Ohio in 1951, spent 22 years in Oregon under an assumed name, working as a carpenter, carrying guilt like a second skeleton. When Hendricks contacted him, he cried for the first time in decades. He still had the documents, every copy he'd made, every file he'd stolen, hidden in a safety deposit box under his false name, preserved like evidence for a trial that never came. Hendricks brought them to federal prosecutors. The trial began in June 1974, not against individuals, most were dead, but against the system. A civil suit against the Department of Defense, the state of Ohio, and Willowbrook Institute for Illegal Human Experimentation, Sarah testified. On June 18, 1974, 51 years old, voice permanently damaged, Sarah Elaine Whitaker sat in federal court and spoke the truth she'd carried for 23 years. The jury listened, the media listened, America listened. The verdict came in November 1974. Guilty on all counts. Reparations paid. Institutional oversight mandated. Willowbrook Institute closed permanently in 1976. Sarah was released on December 3, 1974. She walked out of Willowbrook Institute after 8,635 days of confinement. Her mother had died in 1968, never knowing if her daughter was alive. Sarah moved to a small town in rural Pennsylvania, changed her name legally, not to hide, but to reclaim the identity that had been stolen. She lived quietly, avoided publicity, refused interview requests. The settlement money paid for a small house. She worked part-time in a library, grew vegetables in a garden, lived the anonymous life of a person who'd learned that survival sometimes requires invisibility. She never married, never had children, never spoke publicly again after the trial. But once in 1998, she agreed to record a final statement. The interviewer was a graduate student researching institutional abuse. The tape ran for 2 hours and 14 minutes. It began, "My name is Sarah Elaine Whitaker, patient number 472. They drowned me 22 times. It ended. I need you to understand, it wasn't water that killed us. It was the silence after." Sarah Elaine Whitaker died on November 12, 1998. At 75 years old. Cause of death? Respiratory failure. Complications from long-term pulmonary damage sustained decades prior. She was buried in a cemetery in Pennsylvania with a headstone that read simply, Sarah Whitaker, 1923-1998. She spoke. The tape was archived. The documents were sealed under 75-year federal classification. They were declassified in 2026. That's when the world finally heard. That's when Sarah's voice, damaged, ruined, but unbroken, spoke across time to tell the truth that power had tried to drown. Some women refused to be erased. Some memories refused to die. And some voices, even when silenced, echo forever. In a world that tried to erase them, women who never returned remembers.